Ladies and gentlemen, it is a wonderful privilege to have been asked to give this lecture. Provost has worked in South Africa in the early days. I've reached the stage in my growth when I get to be very repetitive, telling the same stories all over and over again, and telling them even to the person who first told you. I was thinking just the other day how quite a few years ago they named a school after me in a very, very small village in the Netherlands. The school was celebrating its 400th anniversary. My wife and I went to join in the celebrations. And when we arrived, a little girl came up to me and said, "Were you here when the school started?" I thought I was decrepit, but not quite so obviously. Oh, by the way, they've since renamed the school. It is not easy for today's youth to believe that not so long ago we had Bibles that had dates in their side panels for many of the events described in those Bibles. There was a date even for the creation narratives that were read as straightforward literal accounts of the events they purported to describe. They were, after all, the Word of God. But of course, were they such straightforward accounts meant to be understood literally? The point I'm making is that, as you all know so very well, not to know the literary genre one is dealing with can lead to asking inappropriate questions. I wandered lonely as a cloud, Wordsworth acclaimed, when all at once I saw a host of golden daffodils dancing in the breeze. We would be laughingstocks, rightly so, if we were then to ask what band was playing for the daffodils. So we would ask whether those creation narratives not more like poetry rather than prose. The incredulous skeptic has played an important role through asking awkward, inconvenient questions to make belief in God more intellectually credible and respectable. But there must be something ironical in the fact that the biblical creation narratives actually made it possible to speak about nature and creation with their own autonomy and order. Up until these narratives appeared, natural science was almost entirely impossible because the natural order was considered to be inhabited by all kinds of deities and spirits whose chief attribute was being capricious, sometimes amicable, but mostly unfriendly and vengeful and totally unpredictable. It is high irony that the biblical account of creation helped to desacralize, to demythologize nature, and so to make science possible. Before this point, as I noted earlier, creation was inhabited by a whole pantheon of gods. Virtually every phenomenon or creature was a deity or was inhabited by one. The god of storms, the god of fires, the moon, the stars, the sun, were gods or were the abode of one or other deity. And the chief characteristic of most of these gods was that they were capricious with moods that changed at the drop of a hat. No hope here of the uniformity and regularity that are chief attributes of the nature that scientists study. Water is H2O almost without fail everywhere in the world, displaying predictable attributes any and everywhere. This makes an orderly existence possible since we will hardly ever be caught napping. You know that putting your hand on a hot stove will be painful, universally and always. You know that you cannot normally have recourse to some esoteric formula that can enable you to alter this particular cause and effect. And this largely autonomous reality has helped those who would speak of man's coming of age, of the death of God, of the near irrationality of belief in the existence of a deity. But the God I worship is not cringing in fear and anxiety that God's creature will discover more and more secrets that God has been guarding jealously. The God I worship is not scared that God's domain is receding with a rampant creature devouring every remaining domain of the so-called God of the gaps. No, the God I worship urges us on to be as adventurous as possible, gloriously adventurous and innovative, seeking to pierce the mysteries of creation. The God I worship is not threatened by our discoveries and inventions. It is that we should exclaim, as we are confronted by the marvels that women and men unveil and new inventions they produce, undertaking heart transplants, traveling to the moon, and all and everything that evokes our awe and admiration. We should be led to exclaim, if the creature is so wonderful, how much more wonderful must the Creator be? God does not want us to be docile and uncritical and infantile. No, God, my God, your God, desires that we be at our best, at our sharpest, intellectually and morally. God is jealous of our intellectual and moral integrity. God had much rather we were skeptics, even cynics, yes, and even avowed atheists, rather than believers who had been cowed into belief. In my view, a theistic explanation of all there is seems intellectually, morally, and in every other conceivable way more satisfying than its alternative. I cannot bring myself to believe that the universe and all it contains and the manner of its workings could have been the result of some cosmic accident. It is just too bizarre. What was there before this cosmic event happened? It is too much to think back ad infinitum of something we don't know what, that somehow or other set everything in train, and that there should have then emerged a cosmos through a hapchance event. It satisfies my intellectual integrity more that there is a self-caused cause or uncaused cause, but not the God of philosophers derided by Pascal, but the God of the Bible, compassionate and caring, loving and forgiving. I do not know that too many would be self-sacrificing, willing to go to the gallows or to be incinerated for the God of the philosophers. But many who have laid down their lives for this God, for fellow believers and even for unbelievers, that is one to whom I give my own loyalty. Perusing human history, it must surely say something about the veracity of their belief that thieves of some order or other have been willing to give up their lives for others, have been dedicated to the welfare of others, inspired by their faith in a deity of some kind or other. And so we can speak of a Mahatma Gandhi, a Martin Luther King Jr., a Dalai Lama, a Mother Teresa. That said, it is also true that religion has been used as a tool that differentiates them from us. For many centuries, perhaps since the birth of humanity itself, people have contrived extraordinary means of cruelty, physically and economically, to dominate those they identify as different to or lesser than themselves. The Persian, Roman, and Arabian empires conquered vast tracts of land. More recently, we endured the Crusades, the colonial era, Adolf Hitler, apartheid, Bosnia, Rwanda, and you go on and on and on. In each instance, the actions of the aggressors were underpinned by quasi-political doctrines, affiliations to particular sets of cultural and or spiritual beliefs, and misguided senses of their own superiority and supremacy. We're still doing it, not least in Israel and Palestine, in the broad confrontation between the Judeo-Christian and Muslim worlds that has characterized the 11 years since 9/11. And within our communities, the expression of xenophobia in South Africa, homophobia, and all the other forms of intolerance we can think of. We are so consumed with the others that we fail to recognize the most simple truth, that no matter where we come from or what we call God, we are in fact members of one family, the human family, and we are all made for goodness. We are made for unity, for togetherness. We are made for reconciliation. We are made for love. The view that religious affiliation should not determine civil, social, and political considerations has been around for centuries. 12th century Andalusian Muslim philosopher Provost, who worked on reconciling Aristotelianism with Islam, is credited with some of the earliest secular thought, although the term secular was only coined by the British writer George Jacob Holyoake in 1851. The term described Holyoake's vision of a social order separate from religion, without dismissing or criticizing any particular religious belief. Secularism is not an argument against Christianity, it is one independent of it. It does not question the pretensions of Christianity, it advances others, he wrote. It is a great honor, not to mention enormously appropriate, for us to be gathered to consider secularism in Leicester, where the world's oldest surviving secular society was established in 1851. The place of religion in society, particularly in the so-called West, has changed profoundly since. Around the same time that Holyoake was expounding his theory on secularism, another citizen of the British Isles was learning about ubuntu in Africa. In 1851, David Livingstone, the Scottish missionary doctor, was embarking on one of his earlier journeys in Africa across the Kalahari. A few years later, he was to discover the Victoria Falls and much of the Lake District of Central Africa, which of course had been there all along, and there were people. But that's a story for another day. The point is that Livingstone was a good and brave man who, at a time when many Europeans regarded Africans as nothing more than economic resources for sale to the highest bidder, earned a reputation for integrity through his opposition to slavery. He was among the first Europeans to accept Africans as fellow human beings. Ubuntu is an approach to life that is very difficult to describe in English words. It speaks to the very essence of being human, saying, my humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up in yours. We belong in a bundle of life. And so we say in our part of the world, a person is a person through other persons. It says not, I think, therefore I am. It says rather, I am human because I belong, I participate, I share. And harmony, friendliness, community are great goods. Social harmony is for us the summum bonum, the greatest good. That you and I are made for interdependence. You and I are made for complementarity. You have gifts that I don't have. I have gifts that you don't have. And you might almost see God rubbing God's hands in glee. Voila. That is exactly why I created you. That you should know your need for the other. Ubuntu lies at the very heart of post-apartheid South Africa's reconstruction. It was the foundation stone of our new Constitution and Bill of Rights, and it underpinned our Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Whilst most modern democracies today can be regarded as secular on the basis that citizens enjoy near complete freedom of religion, and religious leaders do not have authority over political decisions, the new South Africa's foundational documents and institutions epitomize the characteristics of this secular age: respect for individuals and minority groups, tolerant and pluralistic, freedom of association, equality of all people, common framework of law, opportunity for each person to realize their aspirations, and breaking down the barriers of class and caste. In England, the Anglican Church has loosened its grip over the levers of political and social control, and the country has made the transition to a secular society. Can you imagine the uproar were someone to propose a rule today stating that only Christians could become members of the House of Lords? Where is our bishop? Or be considered for the position of Lord Mayor of London, Lord Mayor of Leicester as well, of course. I mean, yes. Yeah. France, despite controversies over the past few years over allowing Muslim schoolgirls to wear burqas, is a secular state. So the United States, Russia, Croatia, Kenya, Brazil. Sometimes on my travels, I ask young people to imagine a world in which people with large noses like mine rule over people with small noses. It's ludicrous, but no more ludicrous than discriminating against people on the basis of their skin color, ethnicity, or on the basis of their sexual orientation or spiritual beliefs. It is quite bizarre to want to say that someone who is gay or lesbian, by that fact, are different. You know, for such as I, one of the most wonderful images is the image of this Christ we worship, who, strung up on a cross, had said, I, if I be lifted up, will draw all. Didn't say some. Draw all. Rich, poor, white, yellow, black. Homosexual, lesbian, gay, so-called straight. All. That's fantastic. And for some of us, we couldn't have striven against a system that penalized people on the basis of something about which they could do nothing, their ethnicity. For us then to be quiet because people are discriminated against for something about which they can do nothing, their sexual orientation, just as much as discriminating against people because of their gender. It would, for me, make a nonsense of all the things that I hold dear. And so it has been almost automatic that I would be firmly opposed to homophobia of any kind. For me, it would be that if it was shown that God was a homophobic God, that is a God I would not worship. And it seems so utterly obvious that there ought to be no bar at all placed before women for being able to be any and everything. We live in a globalized world, one world, God's world, where technological advances have connected people on a scale that humankind has never experienced before. As they say, if you sneeze here, we can hear you on stereo in Cape Town. The event is tweeted, retweeted, posted on Facebook, and available for viewing on YouTube. In South Africa, in the time of colonial conquest, a group of paler-skinned compatriots embarked on an epic trek into the hinterland to escape newly introduced British anti-slavery laws. They were called voortrekkers, those who pull from the front. And on December the 16th, 1838, they defeated the mighty Zulu army in what became known as the Battle of Blood River. Before the battle, the voortrekkers promised God that should they win, defeat the Zulus, that day would be commemorated for eternity. In a sense, they believed that they won that famous victory because God was on their side. From there, it was a short step to claiming God exclusively for themselves. The 16th of December is still a public holiday today, but whereas it used to be called Dingan's Day, and then the Day of the Covenant, or the Day of the Vow, today celebrates not a victory for some and a defeat for others, but the coming together of all. After our first democratic elections, we changed the name of that public holiday to Reconciliation Day. In the past, members of the Afrikaner flock gathered on this day to celebrate their military supremacy and their God at iconic Afrikaner heritage sites. It was a public holiday that was a source of division in non-secular apartheid South Africa. Today, in secular South Africa, South Africans of all hues and background gather on Reconciliation Day to celebrate their unity in diversity, while Afrikaners are still free to commemorate their covenant with God. One people, many strands of thought, each with the right of expression. In the past, state events were always preceded by Christian prayer. Today, prayers take cognizance of the fact that not all of us are adherents of one faith. As a country, we have evolved in so many different ways, not least in our tolerance and respect for others, and in our knowledge that the whole is much, much bigger than the sum of its constituent parts. In an increasingly interconnected world, where various streams of consciousness and religious belief increasingly occupy and vie for attention in the same space. What is, in fact, the role of religion in public life? Does the secular age require us to surrender beliefs and traditions we hold sacred? Do we dilute our faith by accepting others? Does it make us less godly? Is this the end of public faith? No, and one would want to reiterate very firmly, no and no. Accepting others strengthens our own faith. Goodness and kindness beget goodness and kindness. One should treat others as one would like others to treat us. This ancient truth, common to virtually all religions and belief systems on earth, has been known as the Golden Rule since the 17th century. Some of us, many of us, who were involved in the struggle against the iniquity of a vicious system such as apartheid, supported by millions around the world, were engaged in that struggle, knowing that we inhabit a moral universe, that ultimately goodness, laughter, joy, and compassion are what will prevail over their ghastly counterparts. It is to know that those who rule the roost by suppressing their fellow human beings, who strut the stage of their world as if they were invincible. We know, despite all appearances to the contrary, that they were going to bite the dust, and to do so comprehensively. It is to know that despite all appearances to the contrary, goodness, right, matter, that the God we worship is a God notoriously biased in favor of the weak, of the sidelined, of the oppressed. And we were joined by so many around the world. Sometimes it was exhilarating, actually, to be part of that struggle and to be upheld, sustained by the love and the prayers and the caring and the love of so many, most of whom we would not meet this side of eternity. And one of the great privileges I have is being able to go to occasions such as this one and to say, we ask that you support us, pray for us, help to impose sanctions. And you did. And today we are free. You were able to have opened the doors of the prisons. And so our Nelson Mandelas and others walked free. It is an incredible privilege to say, without sounding horrendously presumptuous, I know I speak on behalf of millions of my compatriots when I say thank you. Thank you for the support that you gave, for sustaining us at a time when it was horrendously, well, you ought to have been horrendously lonely, but we were connected. Wonderful example of ubuntu in the days of our struggle. And yes, thank you. Thank you for helping us to be free. I would have thought you might just have wanted to clap, but then of course you are these retiring, reserved. Well, actually, I must tell you it doesn't matter, because I discovered that I had a magic wand. Only the wise can see it. And when I wave it over you, it turns you into instant South Africans. So I'm able to say, fellow South Africans, let's give these wonderful people a real humdinger of an applause. Thank you. Oh, yes. Let me, you revert to your former selves. By accepting and respecting and revering other faiths, we invite our brothers and sisters of other faiths to revere us. When God advised us to love one another, terms and conditions did not apply. We were not enjoined to extend our love to our Christian neighbors only. In a globalized world, what does good neighborliness mean? Centuries ago, when travel and communications were restricted to the pace of horses, the neighborhood was very restricted. The Arabian Empire was said at its height to extend for 200 marching days from east to west. Who are closer neighbors today? The woman who lives in the greenhouse next door, whose name you cannot remember, or the girl in Bangalore with whom your daughter connects for chats and games for days on end on their PlayStations? The secular age and the globalized world place increasing demands on us for cultural sensitivity and the acknowledgement of our pluralism as members of one family and inhabitants of one earth, but do not demand that we sacrifice public faith. Rather, we thank God for everything we have, especially we thank God for one another. Public faith should be inclusive, where no one is excluded. It speaks to the universal values of caring, sharing, reconciling, and loving. It says, I am proud to be Muslim or Christian or Jewish. It is who I am, but I know that God is a God of all people. Isn't it wonderful that God said to Adam, or about Adam, it is not good for this one to be alone. And that wonderful image of God bringing the animals in front of Adam, passing in front of him in a procession, and God asking, what about this one? And Adam saying, not on your life. and God then putting him to sleep, so the story goes. And then out of his rib producing that delectable creature, Eve. And when Adam awakes, he exclaims, wow. This is what the doctor ordered. Speaking about ubuntu, that the solitary human being is a contradiction in terms. And the totally self-sufficient person is in fact subhuman. And what does it say for the way in which we order our lives? How can we, as family, whose ethic is not eat or be eaten, whose ethic is from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. We are family. And we look on a world that is marked so horrendously badly by inequity. And that is a sure recipe for self-destruction, really. We are going to have to learn, and it isn't a figure of speech, it is literal. We are, and God wishes we could accept this. We are members of one family. We are sisters and brothers. We ought to be there for one another. And our world is constantly going to be jogged by the consequences of this inequity that characterizes our world. And so we see Occupy Wall Street and other instances that are saying, please, please, please wake up to the truth that the path we are treading now is leading to self-destruction. How is it possible, friends? How is it possible that we can continue to tolerate governments, our governments, spending billions on budgets of death and destruction, when we know that a minute fraction of those budgets would ensure that children everywhere had clean water to drink, had enough food to eat, had a decent home in which to live, that they would have adequate health care and an education. When will it sink into our heads that the path on which we are treading now leads to perdition? That if we do not care about our environment, then we mustn't be surprised that it all goes poof. Not in some distant future. 2 or 3 years ago, I was in a service to mark World Climate Day in Tromsø in Norway. And they had 3 people give a testimony, 3 women. And by the pulpit they had a pillar of ice that was melting. Wonderful way of making preachers be aware of the length of their sermon. And the one person who got up to speak was a woman bishop from Greenland. She said, our life is changing drastically. Polar bears can no longer walk on the ice. It's so thin. They sink and they drown. We can't go out fishing, or we can't skate. And another woman from the South Pacific said, the level of seawater is rising, and the trees on our islands, contaminated by salt sea water, are dying. And a young woman from Nigeria said, there is a huge rivalry amongst our tribal peoples for the remaining pasturage. Climate change is not something that is still on the horizon. It is here now. And public faith is to awaken in us a reverence for who we are, in our reverence for where we are. You and I and all of us are members of one family, the human family, God's family. Martin Luther King Jr. said, unless we learn to live like brothers, if he was here, he would have added, and sisters, unless we learn to live like brothers, we are going to perish together like fools. God, help us. Help us. Help us to know that we are members of one family. We're going to swim or drown together.